This is the third in a series of 4 lectures examining the Greek philosopher Plato. We're seeking an overall understanding of his ideas and an appraisal of them in the light of Christian truth. The subject of today's lecture is a set of well-known and controversial Platonic ideas. In general, Plato knew his ideas were countercultural in his time, and that they were opposed by a majority of his contemporaries. Philosophers across the ages are interested not primarily in conforming to the dominant culture, but in reforming it, or pressing it forward to a new form of thinking and living. Plato attempted a great many reforms in his work. In his Metaphysics, he argued that the spiritual and rational take priority over the physical, at a time when the elites took the physical to be more fundamental. He argued that spiritual goodness, true order in the soul and in the universe, went beyond mere physical pleasure and mere temporal political power. In these and other ways, he was a critic of his time. On today's subject, he is also a critic, and that subject is Plato's view of sex and marriage. As you are eminently aware, these are issues of great confusion in our culture, and they are issues to which the Christian faith bears unambiguous witness. Bound up in marriage and sex are matters of no small significance: human love and divine love, the passing on of our life and faith from generation to generation, God's means of glorifying himself in spreading his image across the entire world, creating a beautiful picture of Jesus Christ and his church. These are at stake in marriage and sex. You might think Plato's an odd figure to study on this subject. Take a moment and consider, what do you know about Plato's ideas on these issues? If I gave you more time, I think eventually many of you would arrive at 2 claims that you already have some background familiarity with. First, Plato supports homosexuality. Second, Plato supports the elimination of marriage. In other words, Plato has a total rejection of Christian chastity and the reservation of sex for marriage. The great American president Ronald Reagan once said, channeling an old American folk saying, "The trouble with our liberal friends isn't that they're ignorant, it's that they know so much that isn't so." I believe when it comes to Plato's view of sex, there's much we know that just isn't so. So today I'm going to argue that these common and widely held beliefs about Plato are mistaken. The true situation is, in fact, quite the opposite. In fact, Plato rejects homosexuality, and he defends marriage as a necessary social institution aimed at procreation. In short, Plato is by and large a traditionalist on marriage and sexuality, and he's a strong critic of the homoerotic culture in which he found himself. Plato's better than we think in these areas, but he's not as good as he could be. We'll note some weaknesses at the end of the talk. So let's consider sexuality first. You might think this is going to be the harder half of the talk. Isn't there substantial evidence that Plato supported same-sex sexual behavior? That's the widespread view, and there is some basis for it. In many dialogues, Plato discusses homoerotic desire and action. Plato's dialogues of Lysis, Charmides, Phaedrus, and Symposium all feature prominent central discussions of it. In Plato's Lysis, Socrates and his friends become bashful in the presence of a beautiful male youth. In the Phaedrus, 2 same-sex friends go on an erotic walk down by a stream. Most forcefully, you might point to the discussion in Plato's Symposium. In that dialogue, a group of friends at a drinking party offer a series of speeches in praise of eros, passionate desire, romantic love. For them, the best kind of erotic partnering is male-male, same-sex. That, they think, is the crown of human sexual relationships. One of the speeches in that dialogue has a vivid story about the origin of human beings and the source of their longing for one another. Put into the mouth of the playwright Aristophanes, he gives this kind of a story. He says originally human beings had dual bodies. Every person was made with a shared body, side by side with another person. We had 2 heads, 4 arms, 4 legs, 2 people, one body. But we offended against the gods, and Zeus punished us by separating us from our body mate. He cut us in two, leaving us with a permanent wound. And so now we wander the world searching for our lost soulmate or body mate so that we might find them, unite with them sexually, and thereby become whole. And so the common view argues that for Plato, this is not only why we consider sex so important, but also why some people sexually desire members of the same sex. In this original creation myth, some men were bodily joined with other men, some men with women, and some women with women. So as we search for our lost partner, it might be someone of the opposite sex, or it might be someone of the same sex. Some people sexually long only for members of the same sex. This is a great deal of evidence that homosexuality is not just normal and accepted by Plato, but is even praised as crucial for self-realization. And again, as I've mentioned, this is how most people take Plato to think about same-sex sexuality. This idea even made it into the oral arguments of the Obergefell Supreme Court case, the 2015 case which imposed same-sex marriage on our entire country. Justice Samuel Alito appealed to Plato as an example of someone who supported homosexuality but didn't support same-sex marriage. This was presented as evidence that opposition to same-sex marriage is not automatically rooted in animus against people who engage in same-sex sexual activity. So it would seem that Plato's support of same-sex sexuality is exceedingly well established. But this is not the final word on this issue. It's only the opening statement. And I think there are very good reasons why Plato talked about homosexuality the way he did without affirming it. And there are good reasons why Plato puts the myth of the symposium into the mouth of Aristophanes. So I want to try to show you now that Plato's real views are quite different from the initial appearances. So consider first, it's possible to regularly talk about something without endorsing the idea. Talking about something a lot doesn't mean you like it. It just means you think it's important to talk about, for one reason or another. Today, for instance, you might talk a great deal about critical race theory. You might do this not because you are endorsing it, but because you are trying to reach those deeply enmeshed in it. If you were to write a Socratic dialogue today, its setting may be at the sidelines of a political protest, walking on the way to an LGBT support group, or at a subway stop after a bureaucratic meeting to impose further COVID-related restrictions on an already reeling populace. Okay, that's not a charitable way to put it, and it wouldn't be an effective way if you were genuinely trying to draw in a hostile crowd, but hopefully you see the point. Plato sought to speak to the elites of his time, and so he fills his dialogues with themes and content that he believes will actually bring them in. Sometimes you persuade with a hammer blow, but many times you persuade by drawing someone in and helping them to see things in a new light. The pervasive presence of homoerotic themes in Plato says more about his culture than about himself. It's well known and quite accurate that the Greek elites of the 500s to the 300s BC engaged in pederastic relationships between older and younger men. It was a pervasive part of the culture, not engaged in and endorsed by everyone, but widespread with a recognized presence. Plato presents the framework in order to challenge it, to move his audience from distorted sexual desires into more chaste and productive passions. Here's another thing to think about initially about the symposium and Aristophanes' myth in the symposium. In real life, did Plato like Aristophanes? These are two historical figures. Did Plato like Aristophanes? The answer is no, he did not. Why not? Well, Aristophanes, who wrote comedies, publicly mocked Socrates, Plato's teacher, painting Socrates as a socially harmful character. And this character defamation was part of what led to Socrates' famous trial and execution in 399 BC. You can see this defamation in Aristophanes' work, The Clouds. In The Clouds, a forlorn agrarian gentleman named Strepsiades is trying to get rid of his massive debt. He's incurred this debt because of his son's and wife's spendy habits. He hits upon the plan to send his son to study with Socrates, at Socrates' thinkery in Athens. There he says you can learn how to make the weaker argument the stronger. And with this newfound power, his son can argue his case in court and get his debts canceled through legalese. So Socrates is portrayed as a head-in-the-clouds philosopher. He actually enters the stage of the play in a bucket suspended from above in an apparatus. And this head-in-the-clouds philosopher corrupts the youth. These are precisely the same charges leveled against Socrates in Plato's Apology by a group that he calls the older accusers, the ones who have been informally attacking Socrates for a long time, stirring up negativity against him, corrupting the youth by making the weaker argument the stronger, and denying the gods. Plato explicitly mentions a writer of comedies as the chief source of these scurrilous charges in the Apology. So Plato is actually out to embarrass Aristophanes, not to praise him. Aristophanes' words in the Symposium are designed to shame him rather than to build him up. Imagine a progressive left-wing writer today depicting a dialogue between Rush Limbaugh and some politicians. Would this progressive author put his own personal views into the mouth that speaks into the golden EIB microphone? Not likely. Instead, we should expect his opponent to offer not only a weak view, but one that is ridiculous, absurd, downright embarrassing. And this is exactly what Aristophanes' wild myth is. It's nuts. Everyone knows it. The more magnanimous that an author is, the more conceivable that they could put truths into the mouths of their enemies. And I agree, Plato is magnanimous. And I think even there are some secondary points in Aristophanes' story that Plato wants to defend as right. But overall, there is a very high hurdle to climb to reach the conclusion that Plato is endorsing the overall ideas in Aristophanes' speech. And there's no reason to climb that hurdle in this case. Okay, with these two initial considerations raised, let me now argue a bit more directly. I have two direct arguments that show that Plato forcefully rejects the idea that men should have sex with men. And he rejects it in clear and decisive ways, in the Symposium itself and in his dialogue, The Laws. In the final part of the Symposium, the character of Socrates rejects same-sex sexual activity. Once Alcibiades crashes the party, in perhaps the greatest theatrical moment in all of Plato's dialogues, he decides to give a speech in praise of Socrates. And in that speech, he describes how he himself, as the most attractive young Athenian, the most well-bred young Athenian, he himself tried to seduce Socrates. But Socrates would have none of it. Alcibiades went so far as to loosen his clothes, climb in bed with Socrates, and wrap his arms around him, but nothing happened. Here's how Alcibiades describes it at the end of the Symposium. I slipped underneath the cloak and put my arms around this man, this utterly unnatural, this truly extraordinary man, and spent the whole night next to him. Socrates, you can't deny a word of it. But in spite of all my efforts, this hopelessly arrogant, this unbelievably insolent man, he turned me down. He spurned my beauty, of which I was so proud. Members of the jury, for this is really what you are. You're here to sit in judgment of Socrates' amazing arrogance and pride. Be sure of it, I swear to you by all the gods and goddesses together, my night with Socrates went no further than if I had spent it with my own father or older brother. Plato creates a perfect opportunity for endorsement of same-sex sexuality in the character of Socrates. And yet he, the greatest of men, instead categorically rejects it. Why? Well, here is the punchline. Beauty should lead us to true virtue, to true goodness, and not to indulgence. Ordinary Greeks saw beauty as for the gratification of the flesh. Instead, beauty should lead us upward toward higher things, towards those things which are truly good and valuable. Sex should not be some animalistic indulgence, but a humanized, intentional action whose aim is the aim of all human actions, the genuine pursuit of genuine goods. Socrates possessed moderation and courage, strength of character and wisdom. Male-male love should be the non-sexual love that's between father and son, brother and brother. Instead, the true bacchanalian revelry we should all go in for is not the frenzy of sex, but the frenzy of a good argument, truth itself. Our hearts should be struck and bitten by philosophy, the love of wisdom, whose grip on young and eager souls is much more vicious than a viper's and makes them do the most amazing things. That's a quote, again, from Alcibiades in the Symposium. The words of wisdom are what makes men good, not indulgence in sexual license. Pederasty cannot do it. Trading sex for an introduction into high society and mentorship in a professional career is harmful, not helpful. It damages the soul through corrupt practices and passionate indulgence, when that passion should be given instead to truth and righteousness. Plato urges us instead to fall in love with the truth, to be drawn towards what is real and good, to let physical beauty lead us to spiritual beauty, to what is divine, eternal, and unchanging, to ascend the ladder of love, to find our ultimate desire in the one beyond all comprehension. This consuming urge for truth and reality, for God, should be overwhelming, like romantic love. The ascent to God is the drawing of love. So doing philosophy, the love of wisdom, is like being possessed by the gods, having indwelling divine mania. You do things that people around you don't understand. You say things that seem incomprehensible to others, but it's not because you are truly insane. It's because you are seized by the power of a great affection for the greatest good. So the Symposium itself, I argue, is powerful evidence for Plato's opposition to same-sex sexuality. Okay, I promised a second direct argument for that conclusion, one based upon the dialogue, The Laws, and I will give that argument in just a moment. But before doing so, I want to introduce the final main topic that I want to address today, and that is Plato's view of marriage. Given the transcendent significance of sex for Plato, although the significance mostly comes from leaving sex behind, does he also have an equally transcendent view of marriage? And the answer there is that he also mostly leaves it behind as well. Now, on the biblical account, marriage is the highest of human relationships. It's the first human relationship. It's the first that's filled with poetry. You are now bone of my bone and flesh of my flesh. You shall be called Isha, for you were taken out of Ish. It's the most intimate human relationship where two become one, a union of two into one flesh, practically one organism. It's the relationship which depicts God's relationship to creation, Jesus and his church, the union of man and woman. And in that union, we see a foretaste of God's promise that one day the dwelling place of God shall be with man. When man and woman dwell together, they proclaim God loves us, God cares for us, God is a fruitful creator, and God will be with us always. These are incredible truths that God has woven into his world, and we're privileged to be able to participate in them. And here I'm afraid we're going to have to be very critical of Plato, because he really misses this. Let's see how. He doesn't miss it by fully eliminating marriage. So let me address that issue first. Recall that I said at the beginning of the talk, the common view of Plato on marriage is that he's against it, full stop. And the basic Platonic anti-marriage argument is supposed to go like this. In the Republic, Plato creates a city in speech, in which the highest and most successful classes no longer marry. This city in speech is an ideal. It's what Plato thinks life should be like if we were doing things correctly. And it's not only an ideal, it's possible. Socrates repeatedly argues it's possible. And so the elimination of marriage among the guardians in the Republic shows that Plato thinks we should get rid of marriage. So what should we make of this argument? Well, the ruling class in Plato's Republic really does live a strange and unusual life. Not only is the education elaborate and androgynous, men and women studying the same things and getting the same training, he imposes a community of property and of women. He writes that in the guardian class, all these women are to belong in common to all the men. None are to live privately with any man, and the children, too, are to be possessed in common, so that no parent will know his own offspring or any child his parent. Now, instead of letting Athens do Athens and letting people hook up whenever and however they want, sexual activity is going to be heavily regulated in this ideal city. He writes that promiscuous intercourse is impious in a city of happy people. The rulers won't allow it. So no private marriages. Instead, there's state-sanctioned rendezvous aimed at good breeding, eugenics, to make the population overall healthier. It is a very wild proposal. Why does he do all this? What's the point? Well, he's very clear about the purpose of this communism of property and the sexual community of men and women. The point is this: to limit attachment to the nuclear family and to create a stronger attachment to the whole community. The family is a problem for total state unification. Societies have the constant challenge of how to get people to subordinate their personal interests to the common good. Anytime we try to establish something for the common good, personal interest rears its head to intervene. This applies not only to individual personal interest, but also family interest. People will privilege their family over almost anything else. Family versus strangers, we choose family. Family versus political obligation to all citizens, we choose family. If you can appoint your son to a position, regardless of whether he's qualified for it, you do it. People use their power to benefit themselves and those close to them. And they're unwilling to deny their family members these benefits, even when it's in society's best interest. So the challenge is how to move their affections away from their immediate relatives and place them onto the broader community. How do we get people to love their neighbor as themselves? The most extreme way to do this ever conceived is Plato's. Eliminate the nuclear family, and instead seek to extend family feelings to all citizens, or at least to a large portion of them. He breaks down the family, the small unit, as a sacrifice to the larger unit, the city as a whole. This is the purpose behind the wild ideas in this part of the Republic. Now, we should note that there is actually a piece of this impulse which is correct, I think. We all must subordinate our personal interests to the interests of others. We all must view ourselves and our families as on mission for God, seeking to fulfill His purposes in the world, not just seeking some kind of limited benefit for ourselves. So if that means my children go on to be missionaries, to be poor, to be like the Apostle Paul and get beaten, chased out of towns and die as martyrs, that would be a success. To live is Christ. And further, our spiritual bonds and Christian fellowship should be, in a sense, stronger than the bonds uniting us to our natural families. At the end of Matthew 12, Jesus' mother and brothers come to speak with him, and when he's told they're there, Jesus replies, "Who is my mother and who are my brothers?" Pointing to his disciples, he said, "Here are my mother and my brothers. For whoever does the will of my Father in heaven is my brother and sister and mother." There are lots of exegetical questions here, but one thing is clear. Our sphere of intimate concern and care must not terminate with our natural families, although care for them and love them we must. It must extend further to all our spiritual brothers and sisters, fathers, and mothers. Plato seeks a limited political version of this, a pale reflection of the glory of the unity of the church. What Plato seems to misunderstand here, though, is the role of secondary affections in supporting the primary ones. Instead of viewing lesser goods as fundamentally rivals to the greatest good, we should view lesser goods as stepping stones to the higher ones. The natural family is not a rival to God, but rather one of the main ways that God's love is imaged in the world, and that his mission is fulfilled in the world. God created the world good, not so that it would be suppressed, but so that it would reach its full powers. So far from seeing the family as a danger to the state, Christians come to see the family as the origin and principle of the state. In the love of our parents, we learn the love of God. In the love of our brother and sister, we learn the love of neighbor. In the family, we learn to love what is immediate so that we can ultimately love what is more distant. You cannot teach love of the distant without love of the immediate. Humans are finite and embodied. In the Republic, I think Plato has an overrealized eschatology. In heaven, we will no longer marry nor be given in marriage, but will be like the angels. However, until that time, marriage is necessary and salutary. It cannot be eliminated until Christ returns. So Plato's proposal in the Republic immanentizes the eschaton. He's moved too fast. And by the end of his life, I think Plato understood this. And so here's my argument for the claim that Plato's final conclusion is not for the elimination of marriage, but for its reasonable acceptance. I've referred to Plato's laws before in my last lecture. It's what I call the Republic 2.0. It's his last and longest dialogue and revisits a number of issues that he addresses in the Republic. And he offers somewhat different proposals. Where they cover the same topics, I suggest that the Laws is a better candidate for Plato's final word or mature reflection on those topics. Aristotle tells us the Laws was published after the Republic. Diogenes Laertius tells us that Plato was still revising the Laws at the time of his death, and the surviving text does show marks of being unfinished. The Laws is clearly also more practical than the Republic, including many concrete examples of laws that could or should be enacted in a well-governed city. Well, what does Plato say about marriage and family in the Laws? Quite a lot. For starters, he doesn't eliminate families in the Laws, he keeps them. He still recognizes the tension between family and state, and he still wishes there were some way to transcend families altogether, but instead he settles for keeping the family. His plan is still to soften familial attachments and move as much of that affection as possible onto the broader community, but he now views the family as necessary, figuring out how to work with it rather than to work without it. This is still not a positive enough view of the family, but it's a firm rejection of communism and polyamory for both the upper and lower classes. He is still concerned about marriages making themselves into little idols, and he urges us to view marriages as part of a larger purpose. Each individual should be looking for a marriage, he says, which is good for the city, not one which will give him the most pleasure. Idealistic, to be sure, but it points to the fact that marriage is not mere satiation of sexual desire. Instead, it has an important purpose: creating and raising the next generation. Plato's view of marriage is practical and ethical. The fundamental purpose of marriage is procreation, not emotional union. Today, many people approach marriage as merely the number one emotional bond, or as a matter of formalizing your relationship with your number one person, to use John Corvino's language. When a relationship gets deep enough and intimate enough, it should become a marriage. This way of thinking goes. Marriage is to your best friend. This way of thinking became popular in the West over the past 150 years, as contraception was increasingly embraced, and as Christian standards of chastity declined. Sex became fundamentally about self-expression and pleasure. Instead of seeing marriage as a practical partnership for economic and family life. It became merely a means for two careerists to live together to save on rent. Several recent books have explored this idea, this transformation and development. Mark Regnerus' book, The Future of Christian Marriage. Scott Yenner's book, The Recovery of Family Life. For a slightly older book, What is Marriage by Sharif Girgis, Ryan Anderson, and Robert George also holds up very well. So again, for Plato, marriage is a practical partnership for the sake of children. It's the union concerned with procreation. He writes, "Sexual intercourse in accordance with nature is for the production of children." He continues, "The bride must be determined, as must also the groom, to present the city with the finest and best children they possibly can. They are partners in this enterprise. The husband must break away from his father and mother." This is a continuing quote from Plato's Laws. "The husband must break away from his father and mother and establish a home and a place of upbringing for him and his children. The husband and wife together must leave their own homes, free for their mothers and fathers or for their wife's relatives, and establish a little colony of their own. There they can live, with an eye on their parents and their parents' eyes on them, fathering and bringing up children, passing on the torch of life, as it were, from generation to generation, with constant attention to the gods as the law demands." That's the end of the quote. Not bad, Plato, not bad. He misses the spiritual meaning of marriage, but he recognizes the natural meaning. Marriage is for lawful procreation and the cooperative partnership of man and woman. This is why, as part of this new ideal city that he establishes in the Laws, non-marital sex of all kinds is outlawed. Since sex is for procreation, any non-procreative sex will be illegal. Promiscuity of all kinds, not allowed. Same-sex sexual activity in particular he singles out for total legal prohibition. Here's how the law treats same-sex sexual activity in the Laws. It says, "Get men to steer clear of sex with the male, which is a deliberate killing of the human race, sowing seed on rocky, stony ground, where what is sown will never take root and develop its true nature. And with the female to avoid cultivating any soil where you wouldn't want the seed to grow." In contrast to marital union for the sake of children, same-sex unions are, he uses the words, not natural, me fuse. Sexual promiscuity of all kinds, he argues, is contrary to sound virtue. It leads to moral weakness, softness, indulgence. It trains you to surrender to your appetites rather than to make your appetites serve the good of the whole. Is someone really going to think that engaging in non-marital, non-procreative sex is helping you become more self-controlled and moderate? Plato replies, quoting, "Nobody is going to believe that for a moment. In fact, just the opposite. Everyone will have harsh words for the weakness, the malakia, of the person who gives in to pleasure and cannot hold out against it." Okay. I've now made good on my earlier promise for a second argument from Plato against same-sex sexual activity. And hopefully I've fulfilled my later promise as well and explained Plato's qualified but genuine defense of marriage. For Plato, marriage has an important ethical point, but only limited transcendent significance. As close as he comes to a transcendent meaning for marriage is in the Symposium, where procreation by married partners is a limited bodily way in which we seek eternity, leaving behind children who live on after us. But true moral and spiritual goods, the goods of the soul, for Plato, are produced by those who train themselves in thinking and acting rationally to achieve virtue. And the friendship of virtuous people then gives birth to further beauty in others and ideally in well-governed nations. This work is not done through marriages, but through friendships, and is not done by the powerful, fruitful, male-female coupling, but instead is best done through same-sex friendships. In the end, I think this is a sad omission from a great man.